Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Bold Explorer reading. Thank you so much for joining me, and I apologise for being a few minutes late. I was just uploading a video on YouTube, and I didn't want the machine to be sitting in the other room, which is incredibly hot, just churning out more heat whilst it's doing nothing. So I just wanted to get that uploaded and then turn the machine off, because even though it's a computer, it still generates a bit of heat, and I think we're all suffering from that in the southeast of the UK. Hello to everybody. Welcome along. We're going to continue our reading of The Wisdom of the Fields in a moment. And by the way, I am releasing this as a podcast as requested. So after this, I will download it and I put it onto a podcast. So yesterday's episode is available in its entirety. You do get all this hello messaging at the beginning as well, and me reading the comments out. I just take the audio out and then upload it, and it's available on Anchor FM, which is a podcast hosting service that I realized I'd already got an account on, Anchor FM. And if you put that into a search engine, it should come up, and then within that you should see the book reading. So if you want to catch that and download it later, and as you're pottering in the garden or sitting in your jacuzzi or whatever it is that you do, you can always do that. Before we get going, just like to say a few hellos. As ever, hello to the lovely Julia, to John Morris, to Turbo Stream, to Audrey Forbes Hamilton, to Cynthia Pate, to Turbo Stream, I think I just said, to Lee Lawson, to Graham Cass, to Ben Reeve, to John F., to Linda Kane, to Roland Millwood, Fiona Hammond, and anybody else who's joining us. Thank you so much. Very nice to see you. I want to thank Elaine Brazier, who sent me this delightful book, came in the post. I will send you an email of thanks. I don't know whether you're watching this or see this later on. This is Creating and Maintaining Your Own Smallhold, a guide to sustainable self-sufficiency. A lovely looking book by Liz Wright, with lots of interesting sort of guide notes really on doing that, which is something, as you may know, I'm sort of looking into. I don't know how serious, or I'm not rushing into it. But thank you so much to Elaine Brazier, who has done that. That's so kind. Andy Stacey, hello to you. So let's crack on, because it's very hot, and it will slowly heat up in here. This is the coolest room in the house. The curtains are shut, but the lights are on. Even though they're LEDs, they do warm up. Good afternoon to Ed Loud as well. So we were halfway through the chapter 1, and I'm just calling them part 1 and part 2 and part 3. So on the chapters, because I don't always get to the points in the text where they've separated it. If you remember rightly, we were looking at a little bit of a history of Cobbett and William Cobbett, and how he relates to us, and how he relates to 1945 when this was written, but also how it relates to us. Jeff Kellison, hello. In Phoenix, waiting to get a load. Nice. 45.5 yesterday. Blimey. You need a desk fan. Yeah, well, if any of you would like to come and sit on my desk, then you're very welcome. Right. Let's carry on. So we got to a point where I stopped just a bit short, actually, of a natural break. So this sort of picks up from nowhere, really. Well, halfway through the text. But I'll just read it as is. I'll have a sip of water, actually. I've been out forest bathing this morning, but I am now back covered in leaf mould. On the one hand, it undermined the institution of the small property that, with the economic freedom it gave, was the cornerstone of Cobbett's faith. On the other, for the skilled labour of the craftsman and artisan on whose behalf Cobbett fought all his life, factory work began to substitute the unskilled labour of the machine minder. The early reformers very properly welcomed the machine as a means to eliminating drudgery. What it actually did was to eliminate skill and pride in work, and so create a new drudgery of its own. The drudgery of mechanizing not only work, but men. This alone explains the wonderful reception Cobbett received from the industrial workers. He did not himself think at all clearly about the advent of machinery, but the machine minders of the North recognized in him the defender of a way of life that their fathers, and even they themselves, had enjoyed, and contrasted bitterly to their present servitude. Because the end of life was becoming the accumulation of riches, finance too had got out of hand, and from a means became an end. It had made enclosure a profitable investment, and was sweeping the land workers off the land. It was beginning to ruin agriculture altogether, since when money was being used to breed money, it was being diverted from irrigating the growing of crops. Cobbett saw clearly that prices, rising year by year during the French wars, had upset the whole agricultural equilibrium and made land and agriculture objects of speculation. Landlords refused to grant long leases because the value of money was bound to fall, while the labourers got nothing out of the artificial prosperity of the war years. Small farms were being absorbed into large, just as in the 1920s prices fell after the war and deflation replaced inflation, the full weight of the depression falling on the farmers and the labourers. The farmers of his day were living on borrowed money, just like those of our century. And Cobbett did realise, as few enough modern farmers do, the inveterate hostility of finance and industrialism to agriculture. So, though not understanding the detailed workings of currency, he was sound in his demand for a steady one. But the real point of his criticism of his age is that he saw the immediate issue as shaking the very pillars of society. It was because he perceived this stalking terror that a very demon took possession of him. He prophesied that this financial thing would destroy the stable agriculture of 1,000 years, and in the fullness of time, it did destroy it. In the poverty of the labourer, he called his chopsticks. He foresaw that the debt system would become a millstone round the neck of the nation, and so it has become. He dreaded that, as taxation increased to feed the insatiable debt, so security in and responsible for property would result in the loss of property for the many and too much of it for the few. History has justified him. As champion of the small man, he was vehement in denouncing monopoly. The growth of monopoly is much more pressing issue in our own day than it was in his, but he showed his greatest historical insight in his crusade on behalf of the self-supporting nation resting firmly upon its biological roots. These agricultural foundations, he declared, were the only bulwark against the misuse and the corruption of money. When a secondary economics overbore the primary vocation of agriculture, values went to the wall. While Cobbett was living, England was beginning to correlate her new position as the workshop of the world with its bulked imports of cheap foods from abroad. He was thus considered as stupid and sentimental. He was thus considered a stupid and sentimental impediment in the path of progress. But with us, he emerges as more modern than the moderns. I don't know whether you're getting all of this. There are two reasons why this is so. When Cobbett is considered as a countryman, his faults and failures sink into comparative insignificance. Secondly, the word foundations sums up the whole of him. He stood for foundations, not in any particular period, but in all periods. And though he was the most English of Englishmen, not only for one nation, but for all nations, his modernism becomes a shining light because the modern age has threatened those foundations as never before in our history. Cobbett has often been appraised as the guardian of the commoners of England, dispossessed by the enclosures. He has often been admired as the passionate lover of rural England, the England of the agricultural south that his piercing eye took in from the saddle. But he has rarely, if at all, approached as reflecting and representing the countryman's point of view, whether labourer, farmer or squire. Though often in conflict and very differently placed in station and conditions of living, all three, so far as they fulfil their service to the land, do, throughout their history, share a common viewpoint. In his simple, forthright English, Cobbett spoke it. In fact, he embodied it. He translated it into his politics and economics, into all his ideas about man's social relations. But because the cottager was the foundation of the whole rural structure, as that structure is the foundation of a national life. Sorry, I think I've missed... sorry. It was because the cottager was the foundation of the rural structure, as that structure is the foundation of the national life. It was to the cottager's well-being that he dedicated his arduous life. This perception, for instance, is the key to Cobbett's insistence upon the primary value and virtue of the family. His ruralism can hardly be called a philosophy of life because so much of it was instinctive, but it was certainly a way of life which, with many vicissitudes, had lasted ever since there was an England. The rural attitude to life in which the whole English tradition is rooted sprang from articulate life in Cobbett at the very moment when it was beginning to crumble and give way to alien forces. It is through him that we not only understand what it was in his time, but has always been. Sorry, that's got a little bit heavy about his philosophy and stuff. I don't know how much of that you're able to process and stuff, and that's not indicating that you're thick, but I mean it's quite sort of intense. It'll lighten up shortly. He says, hopefully. He therefore truly interprets the soul of the countryman. The significance of all that Cobbett wrote is that the countryman's The significance of all that Cobbett wrote is that it is the countryman's literature. It is liberally sprinkled, for instance, with tale-telling, and telling tales has been the immemorial social habit of the countryman. It abounds in the colloquialisms and familiarities of country speech. It is concrete, realistic, and based on observations of actual things. It's full of memories, and so is life on the land. It loves parables and illustrations, as did the country carpenter of Galilee. It makes plain statements, as countrymen do, and is as fresh as the fields after the rain, even though Cobbett keeps on saying the same thing over and over again. To read Cobbett is to hear him, for his literature is that of the spoken voice rather than the pen, and this oral language is characteristically rural. It is an earnest and moral tongue, not to say didactic, and the countryside has always been a stronghold of the traditional English morality. And Cobbett's style is beefy and brawny, as it befits the style of a man who glorified the farmhouse meal and home brew. Chesterton has said that there always are two songs in the Englishman's ears, Home Sweet Home and Far Away and Long Ago. Cobbett's life fulfilled them both. To discover the essence of Cobbett's ruralism, we have to accompany him as he rides over English earth, casting on all sides the sharpest pair of eyes in England. It is by what he saw that we gather what he thought, what he taught, and what he believed. Much of the Rural Rides, written between 1821 and 1832, is descriptive of the countryside from the saddle, but Cobbett's eyes never saw the landscape alone as a picture. They saw everything that grew and walked upon it, and not only these, but the politics and the economics they signified. In the valley of the Avon, for instance, he counted 7,000 sheep in a parish of 3,500 acres. The population was 530, and he calculated that it produced enough bread, bacon, mutton, wool, game, and dairy foods to maintain a community of 2,500. This is a good example of how he used a particular observation to illustrate an economic issue of the widest significance. In the same way, his eyes never separated what was useful from what was beautiful, and so all traditional countrymen have seen them. They are bound to be so seen because nobody is in a better position to realise that English country is man-made or man-husband than a countryman. The English countryside from prehistoric times has been man at one end and soil at the other, and this organic sense was the inspiration of Rural Rides. A tree was not beautiful to Cobbett if it was covered with ivy or moss, if its growth was crooked and its heart unsound. He hated firs and spruces, beggarly stuff, which actually he shares with me in that, in inverse ratio to his partiality for the oak and the ash. The picturesque attitude to natural beauty would find this meaningless. But firs and spruces are not a native part of England's flesh and bones, like Kipling's oak and ash and thorn. Long before Cobbett and Kipling, Wordsworth and Cowper, they had been the very stuff of livelihood, trade and beauty to the long generations of nameless craftsmen. That is how Cobbett saw them, both rising from the earth and lying in the workshop. The abstract view of beauty as a thing in itself, plucked out of its context in life and truth, in use or virtue, meant little to him as his view of the landscape to the votaries of the merely pictorial. It would be hardly possible to pick out the whole of Cobbett more than in a dozen It would be hardly possible to pick out of the whole of Cobbett more than a dozen descriptive passages in which he looks at the country apart from the husbandry. He has, for instance, many references to the birds of the countryside, but the kind that figures far more frequently than any other is the rook, the bird that follows the plough. The rook, the bird that follows the plough. Sorry, I've just seen buffering. Is there? Oh, good, no buffering. Buffering and no buffering. Buffering, no buffering. When we've got past this business of what's name, I'll just assure you that it is. This is sort of setting the groundwork of this work. His way of seeing beauty and use as two halves of one whole appears just as conspicuously in his attitude to the human, no less than to the natural scene. At Great Bedwin he saw a bevy of comely girl reapers in rags, and rode on to curse the sight, not to praise it. Cobbett had a sharp eye for a pretty girl, but beauty for him was a mockery with misery behind it. It had to be heart deep. He had no eyes for it when it was only skin deep. Handsome is as handsome does, was his aesthetics. And if he saw with his naked eye a fine and fertile valley, he peopled it in his mind's eye with property holders, squires, yeomen, farmers, and small-holding labourers redeemed from the national debt. A skimpy land, Bagshot Heath, for instance, had no appeal for him at all, while he was always looking for, and seldom finding, a rich soil supporting a prosperous people. Particularly in the cottage gardens, the various aspects of his vision became harmoniously fused. These neatly kept and productive little gardens around the labourers' houses are an honour to England, and to be seen nowhere else in the world. We have to look at them to know what sort of English labourers are, and the English country itself was to him the cottage garden of the world. This part of the counties, Kent and Sussex, was the great blessing for numerous woods. These furnish fuel, nice sweet fuel for the heating of ovens, and for all other purposes. They afford material for the making of pretty pigsties, hurdles, and dead fences of various sorts. They afford materials for making little cowsheds, for the sticking of peas and beans in the gardens, and for giving to everything a neat and substantial appearance. These gardens, and the look of the cottages, the little flower gardens which you see everywhere, and the beautiful hedges of thorn and of privet, these are the objects to delight the eyes, to gladden the heart, and fill it with gratitude to God and with love for the people. Such warmth and tenderness of sensibility are only superficially at odds with Cobbett's harsh and, towards the end of his life, scolding invective. Not only his eyes but his souls were presented with the perpetual contrast between a fertile country where the big bullfrog gasps all, and the people on it were dirty, poor-looking, ragged, and a fertile country of which he wrote, "Here are resources, here is wealth, here are all the means of national power and of individual plenty and happiness." For the wild natural beauty, untenanted by man, he had little or no appreciation. His views thus diverged sharply from those of the contemporary romantic revival, which had little thought for a domesticated nature with man as her partner. A smiling land and a smiling people on it, and by it was his earthly paradise. So what I take from that, just having a short break for a moment, whilst I sort of he couldn't really see the beauty of the land. He saw land as a productive place for farming, but also not only just productive for farming, but for sustaining life, and labourers earning a decent wage for a decent job, but happy and prosperous. He wanted people to be prosperous, but working off the farm. He didn't want them to be beggarly and poor and exploited, and he didn't want them to disappear from the landscape. An empty landscape was not what he desired. And I think that Massingham, the author of this, is referencing all of this and describing all of this because, written in the 1940s, he is seeing that the existing small mixed farms were disappearing, and it was the beginning of the subsidies, and we joined the common market, and the enlarging of the farms, and the pulling up of hedges, and the onslaught of even more mechanization for making money, and not just making money but maximizing the profits. And this progression of which we have seen is as he said, it's it's no longer a means to the end. It is just the end is that the means. Making the money is the thing, not feeding people or giving people a good life. At least that's my interpretation of it. The rural rides thus affords us a general view of what Cobbett stood for: life seen as a living whole. The countryside was an organic whole of which man was one part and nature another. And I think that's a very important thing, that we that's what it should be, isn't it? That the countryside should be an organic whole of which man is part of, but nature is the other part. And you look at the farming today, and nature is shoved out because we have this intensified farming. They had cooperated to make something new from which the natural bounty of earth and the natural dignity of man had flowered in unison. He saw man in exactly the same way, as a creature made whole just by a balance between hand and brain, in a proper equipoise between family and social life, and in an organic relation with the earth. If Rural Rides is the record of how he saw the country, Cottage Economy is the record of how he saw man. Cottage Economy being that book that showed people how to have basically smallholding. That's really effectively what he was saying, and how to bring up pigs and poultry and all of that. It is in fact a brief for the supreme importance of the happy family. Its happiness is cohesion, and its independence were secured its happiness, its cohesion, and its independence was secured by its stake in the land whose soil it cultivated, or whose products it transformed into things of common service. This is the major reason for the primacy Cobbett accorded to the inalienable rights of private property. He stood foursquare for private property as a means to freedom, and for freedom as only to be secured by private property. So he saw that people should have their little bit of land, and they should own it, not be owned and dictated to by the landowners. Freedom, he wrote, means nothing else, the full and quiet enjoyment of your own property. If you have not this, if this is not secured for you, you may call yourselves what you will, but you are slaves. And that's an interesting statement, isn't it? If you don't have property, if you're a tenant and what have you, you are under the thumb of somebody else, and the security of having your property, which is why I guess people do want to buy houses on the whole, and have a garden if you can. I haven't got a garden. His protest against the enclosures was on the grounds that they were an outrageous invasion of private property. He had the wit to perceive that enclosure was making ownership a privilege of the few, and so endangering all private ownership. By separating the family from the soil, as enclosures did, family wholeness was exposed to forces that were disintegrating its happiness, its cohesion, and its independence. The commoner's right to cut turf or fuel upon the waste, to keep cow, goose, pig, and sheep upon the common, was right of property, livelihood, and liberty all in one. It's hard to imagine now, isn't it not, in this modern day, that at one point people, commoners, were allowed to keep animals on the common basically for free, and that was a thing. Whereas now you can imagine, you can have your animals in a field, but it's going to cost you. We're in such a everything costs society. It's fascinating. This right was fundamental, and the right of being able to put stuff on the common. This right was fundamental, and there was no substitute for it. Amenities and a high standard of living would have seemed to him an offering of the feathers for the loss of the fowl. It's an interesting phrase. The offering of feathers for the loss of here's some feathers for the loss of your fowl. But Cobbett never failed to couple rights with obligations, privileges with duties. There could be no wholeness of living without the play and counterplay between them. The possession of land or workshop was conditioned by service both to them and to mankind. This is the dual significance that makes cottage economy the Bible of responsible small ownership. Its object was to instill the principles of family wholeness by written demonstration of how it could be achieved. Economy, he wrote, is management, the means by which a family can become healthy, industrious, self-respecting, self-supporting, and independent. There never was yet, and never will be, a nation permanently great, consisting, for the great part, of wretched and miserable families. Yeah, just look at us now. For families to be unable any longer to maintain themselves by their own steadiness, care and skill was, to Cobbett, a fundamental denial of all that his country stood for. The commonality of England has been famed for its good living. He meant this in a double sense. And what is government for but to secure it? The man, he went on, who by his own and his family exertions could provide good food, clothing and habitation, was not poor. 9 out of 10 must live by the sweat of their brow, and Cobbett, who was neither a revolutionary nor a dreamer of theoretical equity, fully appreciated the differences of degree in wealth and of rank in society. In fact, he regarded the resident squires as the natural leaders of the countryside, but for the 9/10 to be in poverty, that was degradation. So he believed in the squirearchy, or he believed in hierarchy rather, but you know, people should not be slaves to it. Stuart Jackson says we have to go back to small farms and buy local season. This what he calls the fundamentals of basically of man, growing his own stuff, supporting himself, not relying on the work to make somebody else rich. It is a core message, isn't it? It's that core message. When all is said and done, the skills that you really need are those to grow your own food on your own bit of land and not have to work for the man, whoever the man is, the corporate world. I was working with a woman today who used to be fairly high up in the corporate world, taking flights across the world, flights that you and I would pay £450 to fly, but the same flight, but in first class, was £4,000. And these people would fly spending that kind of money, and the pressure to earn the business, of course, to pay for not only the flights, but to maintain the corporate stuff. She said, I had to get out, and now she does these courses on forest bathing, which is to sort of return yourself to a little bit of nature and stuff, and grounding. And she was clearly ground down by this rat race that seems to really stress people out more and more and more. A self-supporting family with only 1/4 of an acre is not poor. That's interesting, isn't it? A self-supporting family with only 1/4 of an acre is not poor. Home baking saves shillings on every bushel of wheat, and even if the bread be but half wheaten, the nutrition of barley and rye was proved by ancestral example. As homemade bread saves the cost of the baker's shop in health and income, so a household with 15 bushels of malt and 15 pounds of hops can brew 1,097 quarts of home brew every year and snap its fingers at the brewery. And of course, we're talking about a time when drinking beer was equivalent to going to the tap and having a glass of water, because water was terribly polluted, or not always safe to drink, depending on where you were. The factories were chucking stuff into the rivers, polluting the rivers, which was going down. So, of course, people were drinking beer because beer was brewed and boiled for a lot of time. And much of the beer wasn't as strong as we may think it was. There were different degrees, small beer, but that would be your sort of everyday. But it was safe. It was safe to drink. And of course, it had natural sugars in it, which gave you energy. It was the what's that awful stuff that Julia drinks? The caffeine fueled Red Bull. It was the Red Bull of its day. In a way, but it was what you drank, William Harrison, in his 16th century description of England, was with him here. 200 gallons of home brew, he wrote, cost 20 shillings. And what a mess of drugs the brewers put into their beers. Well, of course, you couldn't always trust what the brewers were putting into their beers, just as you can't really trust what people put into their food these days. Has it got the nutrition in it that we need, this processed food, the TV dinners and things? More than a century later, Miss Dorothy Sayers, all unconsciously, paraphrased these very words. But few there were today to see, as Cobbett did, the family, the home industry, responsible ownership, useful and creative work, and self-maintenance as indispensable parts of a single whole, upon whose unity rests the security and health of society. And that's interesting, because we don't bother with it now, do we? We hand over a lot of the basics of life to other people. We don't, very few of us grow our own vegetables. Very few of us keep our own animals and care for them and then dispatch them and eat them. Very few of us are dependent on all of that. We let other people do all that for us while we get stressed and buy iPhones and iPads and things like that. Thus, Cobbett expanded his idea of organic wholeness between land and industry derived from it, and family to man's... Thus, Cobbett extended his idea of organic wholeness between land or industry derived from it, and family to man's actual handling of the fruits of the earth his labours won. To tamper with their nutritive qualities, to extract and replace them with synthetics of whatever kind, was to break the cycle between production and consumption. But he also applied this contract between land and people not only to the preparation of natural foods, but to the intimate association between the rural industry and the particular place from which its raw materials were derived. If a man's bodily health was secured by preserving intact the quality of food that nature and cultivation provided, social health was maintained by the interrelation between community and locality. I suppose what he's saying there is that, buy local, eat local, have local food, and it's going to be better for you. I think that's pretty much what he's saying. Just as Cobbett raged in cottage economy against the importation of Italian straw for hat making, when true economy demanded that it should be grown at home, so he described in Rural Rides the monopolising of the manufacture of blankets in the Cotswolds and the ousting of centralisation of cottage gloving in Worcestershire. Here again he referred back to the old England it was his mission to reveal as true England, where agriculture and industry were so closely intertwined that spinning, carding and weaving were practised almost under every farmer's roof. Cobbett saw this organic localism of a multitude of little industries resting on the land and slipping away, not As a reactionary, he was a pioneer of many crops, including maize, or Cobbett's corn, as he called it, and wrote a preference to Jethro Tull's horseshoe husbandry, describing his invention of the drill, but because he always thought of such industry as flowering out of agriculture and family life. What is more, he contended that an entire regional community could and should, in a properly directed economy, support itself in all the variety of its occupations and activities, exchanging its surpluses with those of other regions. He never, of course, attempted to work out any regional planning program. That was not his way, but he did illustrate what he meant from his observation in rural rides, especially along the valley of the Avon. He rode all the way down this fine and beautiful and interesting valley to find that nature and husbandry had combined to heap up a wealth that actual producers of which were half starved. Let me just read that bit again. He rode all the way down this fine and beautiful valley to find that nature and husbandry had combined to heap up a wealth of actual producers of which were half starved. I wonder what he means by that. What a handful of people to raise such quantity of food. He gives elaborate calculations for how much. What injustice, what a hellish system it must be to make those who raise its skin and bone nakedness, while the food and drink and wool are almost carried away to be heaped on the fund holders. Oh, I see. So, in other words, I suppose what he's saying is that somebody's gone in there, paid for all this food that they have made, they are starved, and it's taken away and sold, making somebody else rich, but not the people who grow it, which is interesting. I just have a break here and to see how you're coping with this. I know this seems quite heavy and it's quite intense, and I realise that. We are very close to chapter 2, where we actually start talking about the more modern times. But I hope you'll bear with me just one more session on this. We've got about 4 or 5 pages of this to go. Let me just read some of your comments. The period after the Second World War has left us in a terrible state, says Turbo Stream, and I agree with you there. I'm sorry I'm late. I've been teaching Katya, the delightful Ukrainian. Oh, have you? Oh. What were you? I can't. English. You're teaching her English. Hang on. I need my mouse. Where's my mouse gone? Sorry. I'm just trying to come back to some of these comments. Stuart Jackson says, during lockdown, I think most people looked to buy local, which can be a good thing. Couldn't agree with you more. Think that, I wanted to buy local, but where? Trying to find places that you can buy local now is so difficult, especially during lockdown when you couldn't go very far. If you live in the Forest of Dean, you can still graze your animals, I think, says Turbo. Linda says, it was still a thing in the early 50s. My ancestors were commoners in northwest Sussex. Oh, right. Ben Reeve says, I think Lechdale Village has a common with grazing rights still. It's not a huge patch of ground, but I did see a sign when walking past wondering why it was fenced in. Stuart Jackson says, we'll have to go back to small farmers and buy local and seasoned. Of course, I mean, what Cobbett is saying is 200 years old, and we have, we do have to, of course I understand and accept that we have improved things. We've got, not everybody can work on the land, but I think we've just taken this to this globalization and thinking that the whole world could be, we're going to provide everything for the world. I still think that that's a mistake, and that we need the small farms, locally based, providing the people of the town who may want to work in computers or drains or chair manufacturer or whatever, with natural food, which is going to do them some good, and local food, rather than this dumbed down food that we have no choice mostly to get from the supermarkets and packaged up, that we really have no idea what this food is or how the animals were reared. We have no idea. We've got their glossy corporate websites, but what we don't see, and yet we fear, and we probably know, that these animals are stuffed with food as fast as they can to make them grow up very quickly and slaughtered as fast as possible so that they can fill the shelves with meat that we only eat the prime cuts and we don't eat anything else anymore, and we're all eating too much meat anyway. It is a terrible thing. Stuart says we have to go back. Oh, yeah, I read that. Audrey says the New Forest still has commoners. Yes, I think that's true, isn't it? TurboStream says the period after the Second World War has left. Oh, yes, I read that. I'm enjoying learning how to grow my own food and now trying to store it. Good for you. I have no garden. That's my problem. That sounds a great idea. I'd love to grow my own food. I know some of this is idealized in this modern world because you just couldn't take the shift. But I guess if you look around, how many things, and we sort of know this now from the lockdown and in COVID, how many things have we managed to do without that we didn't really need? And ultimately, what do we need? We need to eat, and we need to drink, we need a roof over our head, and we need people of a shared interest to talk to, and that community to help one another. And it seems to me that we have had that in the past. We've moved a lot of that online now, which is a peculiar thing. I think we need that physical helping with the wheelbarrow and stuff. I'm eating Spanish white beans, which I'm not even going to try and pronounce. Will be a windy one tonight, says Morton Lewis. I'm glad we're not downwind of you. Graham Cass says, I think the Romans introduced parsnips. Did they? Larry Hazelwood says, I cut around 5 pounds of okra. I have people coming to pick it up. I have stored more than I need. Have you picked it every day? Oh, have to pick it every day. Cynthia says, Larry, I wish I was closer to you. I paid $12 last week for a little mess of okra, enough for a meal for me and a pint to freeze. Not quite sure what okra is, actually. To buy local, eat local, but marry a Ukrainian girl, says Morton Lewis. Cheeky man. Cheeky man. What? Oh, right. What is okra then, says Turbo Stream. A good rock band. Oh, Jeff Rotal. You can have all you need if you were round here. I grow everything. We grow gardens year round. I always share. Good for you. Originally from Africa, we fry it, roast it or boil it, put it in jambalaya or other Cajun dishes. Ben Reeve, that's Cynthia Pate. Ben Reeve says, Ian Anderson of the band Jeffrey Tull used to live in the next village, a house called Proflis in Radnage. Tony Blair was once interested in buying it, but also had a spring in the cellar. Or is that a leak in the basement? I, for one, am enjoying the book. Oh, thank you, Julia. I can imagine the former would be a lovely neighbour. Blah, blah, blah. I'm enjoying the book. I should be at work, but this is too hot in the workshop. I've tried growing my own food, but not as easy as you may think, but it does taste better. Edward Moulding says, Cobbett Massingham, the sound of the cocoa sounds like the cocoa farmers. Does it? We need very little. It is the want that is the problem. Yes, that's very true. And I think that the corporations exist because they sell us the want. They make us feel that we need all these things, and of course we don't. But maybe we're realizing that now in the 21st century. I'll just do a tiny bit more. Before I go, if that's okay, because I'm desperate now to move on myself, but I just want to. I don't think we'll get to the end in this today, but I'll just do a tiny bit more. and then we can crack on with the others. I can't remember where I was. And if the population had not been very much larger than as he saw it, why did one valley contain 29 churches and so many ruined manors and parsonages? He was not talking at random. The English countryside of the 1920 to 39 was a wreckage compared with what Cobbett's, which was still landworthy. In his day, the labourers were in rags. In our day, the land was. And he's talking about the 1940s. He saw the gaunt labourer with hardly a coat to his back. He saw hardly a labourer at all. And those we did... Sorry. In his day, the labourers were in rags. In our day, the land was. He saw the gaunt labourer with hardly a coat on his back. We saw hardly a labourer at all. This is 1940s, but it's similar today. And those we did see, though no longer tattered, had lost their status, their independence and economic freedom as holders of property far more completely than his. In his lifetime, the General Enclosures Act of 1845 was still to come. His figures may well have been open to question, but he was not wrong in gathering that the rural community had steeply declined in prosperity, security, freedom and happiness in 1825 compared with what it had been in 1425. He was not wrong in noticing the decline in the number and capacity of the breed of craftsmen who had built those fine and spacious churches. A multiplication of small holders freed from the financial pressure would make the valley of the Avon, and indeed most of England, support a population many times greater than he saw, and at least 10 times, perhaps 20, what it is today. Cobbett was perfectly logical in widening his conception of the self-supporting family living by the land to the self-supporting region. Though more complex in its institutions and gradations of society, it was still in essence, as he saw it, a collection of families. Whatever the differences in status, all owed their lives to the land they lived on, and this imposed upon them a network of neighbourliness. Was it not better, he asks, for the consumer of the food to live near the place where it was grown? This thought, an extension of the theme of family self-subsistence in self-subsistence. Oh, for God's sake, Vobes. This thought, an extension of the theme of family subsistence in cottage economy, is at the core of the Avon Valley Ride that he did in that book. There is corn in the hands of the corn dealers, but it ought to be in the hands of the farmers. Nothing is so sure a sign of national poverty as the absence of stock from the farmer's yard. The corn stacks are the farmer's strongbox, the landlord's security, and the nation's evidence of wealth. Corn, not money, is riches, but money became the master when local production, marketing, and distribution were replaced by a complex system of export to the benefit of commercial interests, but at the expense of the self-maintaining family of the region, and, as we see in our time, the fertility of the soil. In April of 1944, Mr. A.G. Street wrote, "We've wasted the substance of our land in riotous living, in selling crops off, in selling corn and hay and straw and sugar beet and flax, just in order to pay taxes." He, living only a few miles from the Avon Valley, was echoing Cobbett's discoveries in riding down it. It was precisely here that Cobbett was so strong and effective in his appeal back to the Middle Ages. His vision of wholeness, to call it by the modern term of self-sufficiency is inadequate, embraced time as well as space. Just as all true craftsmen and farmers, just as all true craftsmen and farmers rely upon the experience of their fathers and yet are always looking and making ahead, so he had firmly fixed his mind for the continuity of past with present and present with future. He foresaw the ruin of agriculture because he perceived what he believed to be the basic principles of its well-being violated under his nose. It was in the past that these principles had been founded and maintained, and it was in the Middle Ages that the unity between land and people, industry and agriculture, property and responsibility, self-government and the family, master and apprentice had been most honoured. But Cobbett was no medievalist in the sense that William Morris was. His appraisal of the Middle Ages was an accident. He happened to find there the kind of England he believed to be a true England, a very different one from the England of the Wens. The England of the villages and the little towns and the great churches, the England of things made and grown by the people for themselves and their neighbours, the self-reliant England of St. George, not of the dragon of debt that was devouring her. I think we should stop there, but these last bits are just summing up really that whole business. We will start with that next time, and then we will move on to 1944 and the time of Massingham and the contrast that we hopefully will see between farming today and farming in the 40s, and the change that we will witness, I'm hoping. So there you go. Why is our milk sold to the French? We need it in the UK. I know that, this is madness. We will explore all of this. It's even worse trying to buy local in a big city like Birmingham. I have a friend in Nashville. She pays monthly to a farming cooperative and picks up her food weekly. Andrew, yellow tomatoes, another good, what? Not sure what that means. We need that's the problem. Yeah, you said that. For free food, look up Incredible Edible. They organise planting locally and the food produced is free. Oh yes, I did look at the website on that, and I think what they're doing is interesting, but I don't think it's what we really need. But I think it's interesting. If you're enjoying this, do give us a thumbs up. Only 3 so far. Thank you very much. I appreciate everything. We will explore more of this. And it's interesting because Andrew Norris, who lives in Croatia, he's made a whole series of interesting and fascinating documentaries over the last 10 years of the village where he lives and has a little house, and the community of farming, and how that's over the last 10 years has slowly caught up with the modern day. And it's a sad story because the last person who ploughed by hand, I think, has died and gone, but Andrew managed to get that, and they seem to be in many ways sort of 40-50 years behind, and it's sad to see it go. And do check out Andrew's videos, because he's got an allotment. He goes down there. Well, I say an allotment. He's got his little house and farmland, and it's fascinating. And I just wish, we don't have the space. The land is all parcelled up now, and so expensive for anyone to grow their own food. We've somehow made it so difficult. This book here. I'm going to stop in a second. Smallholding. I just had a scan through, because the biggest hurdle, and Richard Suggett told me this, is finding the land, finding enough land, 2-3 acres, so that you could set up a smallholding. It tells you all how to do it and the animals that you can have, and keeping bees and ducks and growing the right type of grass and the assets and all of that. It tells you all of the information. But the biggest hurdle now is trying to buy a parcel of land, and I'm trying to find somewhere. I mean, some of them are available. There's a lovely parcel of land for 40 grand, only 2.2 acres, right up there in North Shropshire, but away from anywhere. And then I understand that a lot of the legal problems is you can't stay on the land. You can't build like a shed without certain planning permission. So we're stymied all the time because I suppose there's too many of us, and if everyone did it, it would all look a mess, and there'd be all this plastic and stuff would be dumped. So on one hand, I can see why councils have got to be diligent and stop people from leaving unwanted mattresses all over the landscape, even if it's on their property, and littering and all of that, which you can instantly see. But on the other hand, you don't want to stop people from growing quality products for the locality. I mean, it's just so, those people that want to do it, we've got to be able to do it. Right. I'm saving my own seed this year. I have planted my seed, Andrew Norris, by the way, in my front garden. I've just scattered it, and I assume next year it'll come up. I'm hoping. I've scattered it and tried to get it under the earth. I assume that's what you're supposed to do. You said it right, Richard. These farming methods are moving from a living tradition into history as I film, and it's frightening. It is frightening. Take care of each other. Yeah, we're all we have. Quite right, Larry Hazelwood. Anyway, that's it for today. I'll be back again tomorrow, and we'll continue. And hopefully, let's hope it's not quite as warm. I'm sweating a bit in here. Take care. Look after yourselves. Thanks so much for coming along. Thanks to Julia for monitoring and checking, but we seem to be all right. Really appreciate you coming. I hope you're enjoying this book. I'm sure it's going to get a bit more interesting. We can relate to it and debate a bit more about it. I will download this and make this available as a podcast on Anchor FM. No Vogue show tonight, but there is another video tomorrow morning. So that's nice. The lovely Julia is offered to cook some chicken soup from soup carcass that she's got. So I'm looking forward to going over there and having some. That's very kind. Saves me lighting the Essie and warming up the kitchen because, the kitchen's pretty warm already. Take care. Thank you so much. And I'll talk to you tomorrow. Bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.